So why don't we go ahead and get going? You did a very nice introduction. So before we get into the details, I want to tell a story. And the story is about Zhou. And so Zhou, who's born Zhao, he was born in China in 1856, and his parents and his family worked in a chicken coop in the Guangdong province in China. He vowed that his descendants would never be suffer the kind of poverty that he had. And so in 1874, at the age of 18, he sailed alone to California by working as a cabin boy and jumped ship in San Francisco. His mother gave him 16 pounds of rice when he embarked from China, and when he landed in San Francisco, he had a quarter pound left. So he was definitely on the bleeding edge. Now, Zhou, like many Chinese immigrants of that time, went to the Chinese Six Companies, which in San Francisco were kind of this, fraternal organization made up of Chinese expatriates and so on that helped him. He went to work in the vineyards in Marysville from 1874 to 1878, and then went to St. Helena. And in St. Helena, he worked in the vineyards from 1878 to 1886. And we know in around 1882 or 1883, he obtained his certificate of identity in St. Helena. For those of you that joined the program 2 weeks ago, my colleague Jonathan talked about the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and the long-term implications of that. Well, this is one of those implications. Zhou knew, or any Chinese labor currently working in America, they could leave, but if they ever wanted to come back, they had to prove they resided in the United States prior to 1882. So we know he did that. But yet in 1886, he left St. Helena because of the rising anti-Chinese sentiment, which we will talk about. And he went back to China. Actually, he joined the railroad, and actually worked on the railroad, the Southern Pacific, as it went down to LA. And in LA, he met a benefactor who helped him acquire a farm. And he grew potatoes in Southern California and got fairly wealthy. In 1902, he decided to return to China, and he married Yang Shi in an arranged marriage, and they had 2 sons. He left the farm in care of a brother who was still back in the United States, who squandered it away. And so in 1906, he decides to move back to LA, which he can do because of his identification card that he got in St. Helena. And 12 years later, he sent for his wife and his 2 now grown sons, and they immigrated to the United States. And then for the next couple of decades, he expanded his really farming empire. And by 1934, he was known as the Asparagus King by the LA Times. And when he passed away finally in 1941, he had a substantial estate, which he had to leave to his American-born daughters because even at that time, Chinese natives could not own land or property in America. But it's truly a success story, right? It's a Chinese success story. It's a Chinese American success story. And it actually shows a couple of common themes we're going to see throughout this discussion, right? He is somebody, a common refrain, right? Born into extreme poverty in China. He came to the United States, to California, to the Napa Valley to make some money, right? To actually make something of himself. He went through the 6 companies, which a lot of them did, and he worked as an agricultural laborer. He also experienced anti-Chinese sentiment. So these are a common theme that we'll see throughout the discussion today. What's unique about him, he actually was a very special individual that we actually know about him personally. And this is something that unfortunately we know precious few about, individual stories that happened in the Napa Valley from the Chinese population, but we do know the broad story and their broad collective experience, which we will talk about. So Zhou was something kind of special, but in his experience, we're going to be able to reflect on this collective experience of really thousands of Chinese that toiled and worked in the Napa Valley and have been largely forgotten, not entirely forgotten. We'll talk about the candle is still burning a little bit, but it is an interesting story. I grew up in Napa, and growing up in Napa, we never heard this. It was not taught in the schools when I grew up, and had no idea that this was such an important part of the Napa kind of experience and what makes Napa so important. So I wanted to share that with everybody. So stepping back a little bit, let's just talk about Napa Valley today, right? So almost 500 wineries, 4 million annual visitors come. I mean, of course, it's been a little low from the pandemic, but that that number is rising quickly, and they have an economic output just in Napa Valley of $34 billion a year. So it's incredible. The commercial wine industry began around 1870, which is where we're going to start our story. But from the first 30 years of the wine industry in Napa, almost all the workers in the vineyards and really throughout multiple industries, including mining and tannery and laundry, were Chinese. But by the early 1900s, they had almost all been displaced, and by Italian immigrants mostly, and run out of town, and their contributions were almost completely forgotten. If you go around Napa today, or you go to visit the wineries, you're going to see all sorts of winery names named after Italian, have Italian names, kind of harkening to Italian heritage, but you see very few, almost nothing with Chinese names. And so it's important, I think, for 30 years, though, the foundation of this industry was built using kind of Chinese agricultural labor. Now, this is not the first time, actually, this group has looked at this particular topic. In my research, I found this interesting clip. This is the Chinese Historical Society back in 1967, visiting Behringer Brothers in Napa Valley and getting a tour and seeing some of the contributions. So it's good. This has been a long journey. This was, of course, this original journey was over 50 years ago. But I think it's really interesting that we're revisiting again. I also spoke to Joyce Chan of the Historical Society, and she mentioned that several years ago there was another group that came up. So I'm glad this is a topic that the Society is tracking, and it's very much worth remembering. So what we're going to do, though, we want to think about right now, when we think about the Napa Valley, you think about wine and wine regions, and there's different regions, and within our the AVA, the kind of the wine territory that we've got, there's multiple kind of kinds of wines that are grown up valley. But we're going to take a little bit of a different turn. I want us to think about Napa Valley around the turn of the century. This map is from 1895, which is smack, pretty much in the middle of where we're talking about. So we're going to be thinking about Napa in this context, and there's four different areas where we're going to be talking about, right? We're going to be talking about St. Helena, which is the middle of Napa Valley, but back in the late 19th century, it was the agricultural hub. That was really where all the farming and all the communities was really centered. It also had perhaps the most antagonistic relationship with its Chinese citizens. So we'll talk about that. There's the city of Napa, which then and now was the most urban and most developed city. And then there's Calistoga to its north. We're also going to be talking about this region up here, which tourists typically don't go to, but this is where we had the Great Western Mine, Mercury Mining, or Quicksilver, as they called it then. That was a fairly big industry back in the late 1900s, and the Chinese were an integral part of that as well. Today, it's really wine and not mercury, but I think it's an important part of the story that we're going to learn. So, as Sean mentioned, what we're going to be studying today is really this. I think of it as a success story. Okay, it is. It has an unhappy ending because eventually the Chinese that came here and worked so hard for 30 years and contributed so much to to the economy and to the culture, eventually were displaced. But for 30 years, they made a significant contribution, not just economically, but also, I think, to the fabric of these different cities in the Napa Valley, and it's worth remembering. And so we're really going to talk about three different pieces. First, we're going to take a little intro into why Chinese laborers, why were they the right group at the right time to make this happen? And it's really very much an opportunity, and the was just right for them. The timing was just perfect. We'll look a little bit at the rise of anti-Chinese sentiment, though that's not really the purpose, but we'll kind of trace that a little bit to see what these workers and the citizens were dealing with, and then think about and study why were they successful, right? Why were they able to really prosper for 30 years in spite of tremendous discrimination? I did mention, and I wanted to just do a quick call out, that it isn't completely forgotten. This presentation comes from a fairly significant research paper I did as part of my master's I'm getting at Harvard when I did a U.S.-China relations class. I'm actually doing my thesis on this as well. So this particular topic I'm going to expand greatly. So in academic circles, in anything that you look up in the Harvard Library, or Berkeley, or whatever, there is nothing. So this is really a forgotten thing from an academic perspective. In popular history, there actually have been there are a few bright spots, and I'll call attention to a couple. Hidden History of Napa Valley by Alexandria Brown. I mean, that is, it's a great book. She has a chapter dedicated to the Chinese, mostly in Napa, but still quite good. The St. Helena Historical Society and Miriam Hansen in particular have done a really good job, I think, keeping it alive and telling the story. And that I want to call them out. Even Napa has got things. There's this. This is a micro park downtown Napa on the picture on the right, and it's called China Point Park, and there's no description of why it's called that, but it actually was to honor the Chinatown that was there at the bank of the Napa River. So there still are a few ways that it is remembered, but generally, from a historian perspective, this is a challenging story because other than Zhuzhou, there are really very few primary sources, right? These are sources written by people or either documenting the events or that participate in the events of a historical event. And that's a primary source. And there's very few because a lot of the people, almost all the Chinese that came over to work in Napa were illiterate. And they didn't speak English. So it's double whammy. So some of them may have been literate, but they didn't speak English. And this combination, and they didn't do a lot of diary writing as far as we can tell. The local newspapers didn't interview them directly in most cases. So we have to rely on a variety of contemporaneous sources that talk about the Chinese, but we don't hear their voice directly. So it's a bit of a detective story to work it out, but it kind of it's an interesting story, and it's interesting to what we can tease out. The kind of things we can learn from newspapers were a big business then, and every town, even the little towns of Calistoga, whatever, had daily or weekly newspapers. The St. Helena Star was quite good, Napa Register. Some of these papers are around today. Those are a good source of at least figuring out what the day-to-day life was like and what at least the citizens, the white citizens of these towns were thinking about. There's also a couple of weekly or monthly journals like the Overland Monthly and Harper's Weekly that do provide some context. There were a few books written at the time, which are useful, and some local oral histories and websites that we can look at. But generally, it's a bit of a detective journey to figure out how we know what we know. So let's sit back then and think about why Chinese laborers, right? What made it such a important point of activity in Napa? And there's really two areas that are important to talk about. First is big agriculture. I mean, a lot of us have heard about the gold rush, and there were plenty of Chinese that came over for the gold rush. But during that time in the 50s and 60s, agriculture in California became big business. Obviously, it became a state. A lot of the land was already taken up and ceded to certain haciendas or certain different places from Mexico, and so land was very expensive. Capital, right? The money you could raise to plant crops and do all that stuff was also very expensive. The source of the capital were on the East Coast or in Europe, very far away from the frontier in California. Transportation was very expensive. The Central Pacific Railroad had just been completed. Marketing was expensive, right? How are you going to advertise what you were making in California to the rest of the country or worldwide? And these large farms had high labor requirements. Well, at that time, during all this happening in the business side, the Chinese labor movement was really picking up steam. Many came over to work the gold mines and the silver mines in the Sierra Nevada. They heard about Sutter's Mill, and a bunch of Chinese came over to try to strike it rich. Additional Chinese came over to work the railroads, right? The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, especially in the California side, was largely done by Chinese labor as well. And so you had these large pools of labor, and when the railroad was complete, the big business, agribusiness, was ready to take them. This was particularly important because the labor organization, the Chinese were organized in kind of a labor boss model. So as I mentioned, many of them were illiterate or only spoke Chinese, but there were certain leaders that spoke both English and Chinese that served as intermediaries between the laborers and the railroad owners, the mining owners, and the farmers or the vineyard owners. And that kind of helped organize and surge when needed. So getting closer to where we're talking about in the 1870s, it was pivotal for Napa Valley. So what happened was in the 1860s, if we recall our US history, right, Civil War was raging, right? So transportation throughout the United States was highly disrupted. And so a lot of competition that the vineyard owners in particular might have had from either East Coast vineyards or European vineyards. You didn't get the wine anymore. And so it gave kind of a clear slate for local vineyards to plant a lot and to kind of experiment and get a foothold that they probably wouldn't have gotten otherwise. As I mentioned, also in the 1870s, you had a lot of the railroads being completed and a lot of labor coming free from that. And the Chinese that come over from China to make their fortune, to make money, this was the next big job that they could do. Also in the late 1870s, there was this fortuitous bug, the phylloxera, that was decimating the vineyards of France. And it did not affect West Coast vineyards much at all. And so the vineyard owners, especially around St. Helena, realized that this was their opportunity, right? They planted like crazy. Every square inch they could plant, they did, because they knew they were not going to have the competition that they were used to having. And so this was something, and then who was going to work there? Well, they could talk to the labor bosses, and you have the Chinese that could surge and kind of labor. It's a very expensive, labor intensive thing, vineyards. And so the Chinese laborers were there and ready to work. And so it was a very fortuitous time. We also talked about the multiple layers of discrimination. Now, I know a couple of weeks ago, we heard about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was a big deal. So in 1882, nationally, the U.S. government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which said that basically unskilled laborers from China could no longer immigrate from China or from anywhere, any Chinese person, to the United States. This was the first act that really barred a particular racial group. And it was a big deal. There was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment at that time. So this was a big deal. It didn't affect anybody currently working here, but it did affect anybody who wanted to come. And so ironically, there was this huge surge of immigration in 1880 and 1881. When people heard this was happening, the two most record immigration years were the 2 years prior to this. But in 1882, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act. California itself had many discriminatory laws passed. The most, I think, notorious was probably they rewrote the Constitution in 1879, 1880, and there was only 9 articles in it. And Article 9 was dedicated to the Chinese, saying that the Chinese couldn't work in a corporation, couldn't work in government, couldn't own property. It was just this incredibly targeted and discriminating document that covered the state. At the same time, also then the local level, and we're just focusing on St. Helena, though every city had this, but St. Helena in particular, they formed an anti-Chinese league, lots of citizen complaints that, any Chinese laborers were working too cheaply. They were taking money away from local white laborers. So this was a big deal that they had to contend with. And just to give you a brief example, just looking at kind of this rise of anti-Chinese sentiment, we're not going to read all these, don't worry, but these are just a few articles from the St. Helena Star. And we can see here in 1874, there was a complaint that Chinese men were using the public school at night to learn English. And there was a complaint, well, why are they allowed to use the school, even when it wasn't in use, because they didn't pay their fair share in taxes. Right. Well, if you progress 1881, 1882, you got the formation of the Anti-Chinese League, and by 1885, you've got 300 people meeting frequently in the town hall, talking about how to get rid of Chinese from their town. So you've got in 10 years, you've got from basically a next door style complaint about people using the school that shouldn't to 300 people agitating for release. So that 10-year period, which really saw the initial explosion of economic activity around vineyards, also saw this corresponding economic economic-based anti-Chinese feeling. At the same time, also, people started doing a moral angle to it, right? So not only was it bad for the economy, but also you had foreigners in our midst, and it was going to affect the morals of the citizens, right? There was a lot of gambling, and there were lots of very vitriolic or kind of hyperbolic articles about gambling. Article in 1883, I like this one. This was actually complaining that American boys were smoking cigarettes that were made by Chinese in San Francisco, and they were getting leprosy from those cigarettes, which seems highly unlikely, but that was the article. Also complaining that, the couple of guys from San Francisco drove up to St. Helena to smoke in the opium bar. And it was kind of like, it's not really the San Franciscans' fault. It's the Chinese for having the opium bar there to attract there. And of course, talked about all the violence in Chinatown. So there was a lot of this notion of, well, there's a moral kind of aspect to it as well as economic. But we really want to focus on, so we have this kind of background, right? Intense discrimination at multiple levels. There's kind of just, really a lot of pressure. But this is where it's like, well, this is like, how successful were they? How were they able to kind of do what they did? How were the Chinese able to really craft very significant culture and population for 30 years in the Napa Valley? And so let's talk about that. So the first would be, I think, basis of economics. That is the key. Money talks, and there was no difference here, right? So what you've got here, the first thing is that the Chinese were willing to work cheaply. And there is no doubt that was a large part of it, right? They would work for $1 a day, which back in the day was, they were willing to work for that without any room or board. That was just they get paid $1 a day. And during harvest, for that $1 for the day, they would be picking an average of 1,500 pounds of grapes a day. So they're working really hard. White laborers or white agricultural laborers, alternatively, would work for $1.50 a day. They would work for $1 a day if you gave them room and board. So if you housed them and fed them, they'd work for $1 a day. Otherwise, it'd be $1.50. So doesn't take, you have to have a degree in economics to realize, well, the Chinese are working for, it's 50% more to employ white workers. So that would make sense that would be a big deal. The nature of vineyard work was also interesting. If you can picture, if you look behind me, right, a typical vineyard nowadays, you have kind of, there's a spike for every single vine, and then there's wires that stretch about 3 feet off the ground. That's where the grapes are strung across, and that's how it helps with picking. Well, back in the late 1800s, grapes were actually planted much closer to the ground, and you had to stoop over to pick them or harvest them. And so it was called stoop labor. And the white agricultural workers felt that was demeaning to do anything in a farm that required stooping over. And so, but the Chinese were willing to do this work. And of course, it was couched in this kind of racial thing of, well, Chinese are smaller in stature, they're more suitable for stooping over. It's just terrible. But that is one of the things that kind of made the Chinese were willing to do this work that you would have a hard time finding people to do that. This also came a time where prior to 1870, prior to the arrival of the Chinese, there was agriculture work was done by kind of Mexicans, Chileans, or Native Americans. Those groups had largely exited the scene, or to a large extent by then. So there was really a gap that the Chinese labor filled. And it's interesting because we talked about how the explosion of wineries and vineyards and everything like that happened at the time. There was a giant labor shortage, right? The planters planted so much that they couldn't get enough workers to work the fields. And the Chinese realized that, and they organized, and they actually struck successfully, and they got their $1.50 a day. What the white workers were getting before, they now got. So I think it shows not only kind of an awareness of the situation and a level of organization to actually go on strike, not get the strike broken, and they won. And they got, much to the concern of a lot of the vineyard owners, they won. Another interesting angle I mentioned is Mercury mining, or quicksilver mining. There are multiple mines throughout Napa Valley. One of the biggest one was called the Great Western Mine, and it was located between Calistoga and Middletown. I showed you where it was on the map. And all the laborers, all the miners in that mine were Chinese, and there were between 200 and 250 workers lived there and worked there at any one time. So it was a fairly big operation. They got $1.25 a day, so they made a little more than the vineyard workers, but I have a feeling it was probably a little more deadly work if you're dealing with mercury and dynamite and everything else that you had to do. There were 2 camps in the mine, at the mine area. One was called Camp Number 1, and one was called Brown China Camp, and they were separated from the region in which you came from China. So Canton was the major region that kind of sent immigrants, I guess. So they all consolidated Camp Number 1, and everybody else was in Brown China Camp. But each camp had a labor boss model and did all that. Gambling was a perpetual problem, and gambling is something we'll come back to talk about. Is every week or so the mine company would send the payroll up to the mine and distribute it out. All the labor bosses would distribute it out to the miners every week, and right on their heels were a set of professional gamblers who would set up, because you have a bunch of single men, not many women, nothing else to do. You got some money in your pocket. You're supposed to be sending it back home to China, but a lot of them did gamble, and that was kind of a perpetual problem at the mine, was getting people to do that. And as I mentioned, the California Constitution, which passed in 1879, which said corporations couldn't employ Chinese laborers. Well, Great Western Mine was a corporation, and it shut down the entire mine for months. So it basically wreaked havoc with the Napa Valley economy. That part was overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court, and they brought the Chinese back up, and the mine could get going. So it really showed, I think, the power of the mine. So this gives you an example. This is where the Chinese were living. This is the kind of the shacks that they built, and they lived while they worked at the mine. So you can tell it's fairly ramshackle, we might say. I did keep the rain off, but you can kind of see, especially with just a bunch of guys living together, it was pretty hastily constructed. But that is the kind of life that they led here. This is a picture, if you can see that, of one of the few pictures we have of the mining team. And what you've got here in the middle, you can see there's some women. So there are some kind of European men and women who kind of ran management, where the store managers were the teachers for a school that was there, and the cooks. So there, but everything else above here is all the Chinese workers that worked here. There's a story, the diary that was written about that time, that said the Chinese did not like their pictures taken individually. They felt that it stole their soul. I don't know if that was true or not, but that was how the diary was written. But clearly, we don't have pictures individually. We do have this collective picture to see this. It's a fairly good sized workforce, and clearly, if you didn't have the Chinese working there, that would be a problem. So economically, they were very, very successful. The other reason they were successful is the business owners liked them. They were great workers. They added a lot to the environment. I'm just going to talk about two. I mean, there are other industries. I'll talk about the winery and the vineyards and mining, but there were leather tanneries. There were, of course, laundromats. There are lots of other industries, but two I've focused on mostly so far would be the vineyards and the and mining. So for vineyards or agricultural work, I mean, the Chinese had a reputation for stability, right? They would actually, if they agreed to do the job, they would do the job. White agricultural laborers, if you could get them, the reputation was, as soon as they heard about a new gold strike up in the Sierra Nevadas, they would drop their hoes or shovels right in the middle of the field and take off east. And the Chinese didn't do that. And so this was perceived as being, well, they're loyal, they're going to stick to their word. My personal feeling is there was a lot of discrimination, a lot of violence up at the mines at that time. And so I think for an individual Chinese laborer to kind of go up there and try to strike a rich, he was really taking his life into his own hands. So it was probably as much self-protection as anything, but it certainly gained a reputation for being the labor force you wanted to be working on your property, because you could count on them. The other thing is that the gang structure, the labor boss structure that I talked about, was important because vineyards, as many kind of crops, it surges. There's the planting season, there's harvesting season. During harvest, you need to bring a lot of people to bear all at once. When the grapes are ready to go, you have to harvest them. The labor boss model allowed them to surge when necessary and pull back when necessary. So it was obviously a nice intermediary level with all the vineyard owners to make that work. There's an interesting story. Now, this picture that we saw on the opening slide, and I've reproduced here a little bit, there's an interesting story behind this, which tells us something, I think. So there were a lot of Chinese mentioned working in the vineyards, and that was kind of the way they were getting it done, the way they're economically making it work. Harper's Weekly, which was a very popular weekly magazine back in the late 1800s, national circulation, had heard about this new area called Napa that was had wines, and it was a big deal to it was an up-and-coming region. So they sent a writer and a sketch artist out to Napa to check it out, to interview people. And that article that was written was really pointed at one of the key turning points in making Napa really a world-renowned wine and viticulture area. But the sketch artist came, and this is a part of the picture that he sketched that was published in the magazine. Now, up to that time, what was happening is that the vineyard owners were keeping the fact they had a lot of Chinese workers quiet. They didn't really want to, there's so much anti-Chinese sentiment, as we know from the 1882 Exclusion Act and so on, that they wanted to keep kind of on the down low that there were a lot of Chinese working there. Well, the sketch artist published this picture, which is you may be able to tell, right? You've got some regular workers down here, but you've got the Chinese workers up here on top stomping the grapes. And there was a hue and cry about this, right? It was like, oh, there's foreigners that are stomping grapes. We're going to get foreign diseases. The grapes are tainted. The wine is tainted. And the challenge is, of course, this is not a true picture. Though they didn't stomp with grapes on their, with their feet at that point. They're mechanical. This is a fairly big business. There's mechanical presses that do a lot of this. This was just I think the sketch artist thought it was a more action-packed kind of picture than just people working in the fields. And there was a lot of hue and cry for the vineyard owners to get rid of the Chinese. You can't have this. This is horrible. And they refused to do it. They did not get rid of the Chinese workers because they were so important. They weathered the storm, And they realized it's totally worth keeping them on. And just right now, the Beringer Winery, which is that picture we saw back in 1967, they were at Beringer looking at these wine caves, which were blasted using dynamite and pickaxes by Chinese and are still in use today under Beringer Brothers. So they were willing to do dangerous work, right? Whether it's mining mercury or whether it's digging wine caves. That was a big deal. So the final piece here I want to talk about and why they were so successful would be kind of this cultural cohesion through Chinatown. So every single the small towns, we have Napa, Calistoga, St. Helena, and even Rutherford, I found out just recently, had Chinatown or Chinese areas. And this was an important part of cultural cohesion to kind of keep their culture together. There were a lot of complaints at the time that, well, the Chinese wouldn't assimilate. They weren't trying to assimilate into the broader community. They were sticking to themselves, not realizing, of course, well, there's so many discriminatory laws and everything against them that the Chinese really weren't able to assimilate even if they wanted to. So it's this classic thing, which I think we see a little bit today, right? Of, blaming somebody, setting rules and blaming people for following the rules. But just here, interesting, and we'll just talk about, briefly this, like, for example, ginger, as we see, this is an ad that was put out in the St. Helena Star on February 4th, 1881. Ginger was the #1 labor boss at the time, and he owned a store. And so you can see, he's got this thing, firecrackers, just 2 words, will be burned Sunday afternoon next about 3 or 4 o'clock in front of my store in Chinatown, St. Helena. The public generally are invited to be present. So what we've got here is we have a relatively successful businessman engaging with the community to bring them together to help celebrate Chinese New Year. So I think it's a telling kind of testament to how there really was some level of integration between the Chinese communities in Chinatown and the broader public, depending, no matter what the anti-Chinese group would have you believe. But these communities generally were pretty self-contained. There was a well-defined class system within each of these Chinatowns that in many times the status was based on your family status back in China. And many migrants, when they brought scrolls delineating their lineage, so you kind of figure out where you fit into the social strata. So just, this is just an example. This is a map. It's a little hard to tell what's going on, but this is a map of downtown Napa in 1870, 1880. And what we've got here actually is you got the Napa River flowing here, and you have Napa Creek going through downtown right here. And there's this little spit of land here, this peninsula that was Chinatown. And so you can kind of tell, oh, it's got a little bit of, there's actually a street, and you can tell there's some storefronts. And so this was what Chinatown was like in Napa. St. Helena's Chinatown was a little bit different. This is actually definitely the road or the railroad coming from the south to the north from Napa and Yountville up into St. Helena and Calistoga. It was at the bank of the Sulphur Spring Creek, and this is a little more of a ramshackle collection of houses or stores and all sorts of different buildings collected there. And what the big complaint, of course, is you're thinking you're coming into St. Helena from the south, right, from San Francisco and so on. This is what you saw. And this is not what the Chamber of Commerce wanted people to see when they visited St. Helena, right? This is like, because it was a bunch of single guys living together who didn't have a whole lot of money. And so it wasn't a particularly attractive spot. And so it is unsurprising that it was a source of continuous tension in St. Helena with Chinatown and how that worked. And so if you just think about it, I mean, I kind of put these into like, there's the good, right? And so it was actually very popular. There were a lot of people living there. Almost 600 people at some points were living inside Chinatown, inside St. Helena, which is about 1/3 of the population of the entire town. So it was a fairly big, big area. In 1870, there was just one restaurant and one shop. By 1880, there was a hotel and multiple stores, a temple. It was a center, as we saw with Ginger's ad, of New Year's celebrations and so on. So it was a kind of a center for Chinese culture. But there were bad things. I think unequivocally there are some bad things going on. Again, bunch of single guys. There's opium dens. There were gambling halls. There were lots of gambling going on. Prostitution. It was dangerous, right? There were murders and assaults and robberies. So there certainly were things you had to be careful with. I don't think you wanted to walk the streets of any of the Chinatowns probably at night. Though Napa's Chinatown had a little bit of a reputation, it was buried, as you saw from the map, a little more in town. It wasn't at the entrance to town, and it was easier to segregate. So the relations between the Napa citizens and Chinatown was a little more cordial than St. Helena, just perhaps from an accident of geography. And there were also, it was kind of ugly a little bit too, right? There were open sewers. It smelled. There were multiple stories about how it didn't smell very good. There was livestock slaughtering going on right there in the street or behind the buildings. A lot of poverty. One of the really tragic things going on is a lot of the Chinese citizens came over following Zhuzhou's model that we heard about at the beginning, because they wanted to make some money, right? They could make their own fortune, some money back to their families in China. Maybe, they wanted to return to China at some point or bring their families over. But gambling, opium, there was a lot going on that kind of took these laborers' money from them. So that was a problem. So there was a lot of extreme poverty going on there. Fire was a constant danger. It was a constant danger everywhere, but you can imagine the shacks and everything all right next to each other. It was not good, and not much infrastructure there. And as I mentioned, there were a lot of the townspeople that really hated them. But there were other things that I think brought the community together. We talked about, there's the New Year celebrations, funeral processions. There were multiple articles about funeral processions that would wind through Chinatown and through town. This example, in 1894, there was a businessman named Li Lao, age 53. He was a Freemason, so he belonged to this kind of Masonic order that was for Chinese. The procession that went to the graveyard, he passed away, it went through Chinatown. There was a wagon filled with roast pigs and chickens and rice. There was a hearse guarded by Chinese wearing red and white headbands. There was 50 Chinese marching behind the hearse. There was a Chinese band at the head of the procession, a Chinese band at the tail of the procession. There were 10 other wagons as part of the procession. There was a ceremony at the graveyard afterwards where couples would come up and they would sprinkle gin on the grave, apparently as part of honoring him. And this is just an example of what we can see of another way that we have this integration, because I think a couple things. One is this coming through the town. So we're integrating some of the Chinatown, the Chinese residents with some of the townspeople. It was a big deal. It was, newsworthy event, and also shows, hey, we've got a local businessman who was prosperous enough that you actually could afford and was worthy of this big event. And so I think it tells us there was some prosperity going on and success going on in town. Just a bit on the religion there. There was a Joss house, this Taoist temple, was in every town and at the mine. So that was an important part of kind of a social hall as well as a religious temple. The Chinese Freemasons, which I mentioned before, there were about 500 to 600 of them throughout Napa County. So it was a fairly big organization. It wasn't related to the Masonic organization that kind of came from Europe and the East Coast. It was a different organization, but it served very much the same purpose. It was a fraternal organization, helped, aid people and so on. In 1891, they finally built one in St. Lena's Chinatown. And again, they talk about this grand dedication. There were a three-day celebration with 10 roast pigs and over 100 attendees, and it cost $5,000, which, it's a lot of money now, was a lot of money back then. So this was a big deal. It was an interesting story. As I mentioned, Great Western Mine, they had a Joss house in that mess of the shacks that we saw the picture of earlier. And the description is worth just reading. I'm going to read briefly from the diary. It was a square barn-like building with large pictures on the walls of various Chinese rulers and deities, as well as of the devil, in front of which punks were kept burning. The religion of the men, these are the Chinese miners there, seemed to be based more of the fear of the devil than worship of any one god. So that's interesting and telling if that observation is correct, but it's interesting how important that was. This is one of our only known pictures of St. Lena's Chinatown. Not sure what the date is. St. Lena Historical Society has this picture. So it's an interesting thing. It's not surprising that fire would be of concern, because it's certainly everything's really close together, and it doesn't look like too many building codes were followed, but I guess it served the purpose. Here's a picture of Napa's Chinatown. Now, as I mentioned, this is, it's along the Napa River and Napa Creek. And this is not a picture, it's a drawing. So it looks a little more picturesque. I have a feeling it probably was not quite as picturesque as this picture looks, but it's interesting to see how all the stilts that were there over Napa River. And there was a lot of fishing and things that would happen in Chinatown as well. I don't have a picture of Calistoga's Chinatown. This is actually a picture of a diorama that's in a museum in Calistoga, and they've got several. And this is a model of what Chinatown looked like in the late 1890s, and you can tell it's built here right along, literally on the wrong side of the tracks, right from the railroad, the Napa Valley Railroad that came up, and you see kind of nice prosperous St. Helena in the background, and you have Chinatown here right right in the foreground. But again, it gives you a sense of kind of the scale of what we're talking about. And here's again, finally, a picture of a house in Napa that was in Chinatown, and some of the residents in front of that. I want to close with talking about, which I think is a very telling story, kind of the battle for Chinatown. I call it the battle for Chinatown in St. Helena, which I think is worth retelling. So as we talked about before, townspeople hated Chinatown. Chinatown itself, there was an issue, as we discussed, that Chinese themselves couldn't own property, right? That was not something that they were legally allowed to do. So the way this worked is a local businessman named John Gillum owned the land. And then he would lease out or rent kind of space for Chinese to build the shacks or their shops or whatever on the land. And there was multiple arguments in the paper, very public, asking John Gillum to we get rid of you have to evict the Chinese. We don't want them as the entrance to town. But John didn't. He actually was, hey, they pay their rent. They're good tenants. We need them for agriculture. So he had a relatively progressive view, I suppose, as far as that goes. But the Anti-Chinese League, they thought they had a solution. So they banded together, as we saw, in mid-1885, 1886, they kind of have a critical mass of people. They pooled their money and bought the land from John Gillum. So he said, all right, John, you get your money for your land, so you don't have to worry about supporting your family. But now that we own the land, we can evict the Chinese. And there was there's a lot of celebration, thinking they had really kind of outwitted the residents of Chinatown. Well, again, in a really interesting example of organization, the Chinese didn't go, right? They organized, say, hey, no, we've got leases we signed with John Gillum that go, for years beyond this point, and we are not leaving. And it ended up being this 25-year court battle on whether the Chinese had to leave. And during this time, many of them didn't pay rent. And so they, I think they perhaps got a little better of the deal that they had 25 years or so of not paying rent and trying to force a stop being eviction. But unfortunately, that was one of the last things. By 1900s or so, the Chinese are mostly gone. Demographics, demographics are destiny, and it is true here. As I mentioned, they were almost all single men. There were few women. There were few weddings that happened throughout these 30 years, but not many, and certainly not enough to really have a viable second or third generation coming up behind to take over the stores and work the fields or whatever. And the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act finally took its toll. So we hear, in Chinese history, or at least American Chinese history, the 1882 Exclusion Act is a very pivotal point. But in fact, really, because it just stopped new laborers from coming in, especially with the surge before, it didn't really affect much immediately. But 20 years later, it did. It had its intended consequence that there just weren't enough laborers available to do a lot of the work. And so so a lot of the Chinese that were left in the Napa Valley ended up kind of regressing and going back to China or back to San Francisco or other locations, and really left the Napa Valley. Italians started arriving in the 1880s and Japanese in the 1890s, and they became, especially the Italians, the replacement workforce for vineyards. So this was an important kind of aspect of that. The vineyard owners also had a revelation that they need to change the way that they planted the vineyards. So they kind of have them up now on the wires 3 feet above, so you didn't have to stoop to harvest, which made it acceptable, I guess, for white agricultural workers to work there. So importantly, it did go. The goal, I think, of many of the Chinese when they came over was to make money and go back to China. We don't know how many did. There's no tracking that I can find about that, but it's interesting to see that. But it was 30 years, really. It was 1870s, 1900s. Fires, kind of ripped through Chinatown multiple times. In St. Helena, in Napa, they decided they were going to they eventually in 1924 and 1927 got rid of Chinatown so they can fill and have a little flood control and kind of carve out that peninsula. So the Chinatowns themselves were basically erased from the map in all the towns, Napa Valley in the early 1900s. There were, just a few stragglers that kind of didn't want to leave that got relocated within town, and Chinatowns by that point were gone. So I think it's a really good story. It's an interesting story. It's a story that needs to be remembered. And I think there's a couple of key, things to kind of recap, right? Is we've got successful Chinese immigrant laborers in many fields beyond what I just talked about for 30 years. It also shows, I think, that, economic realities will trump racial superiority in a lot of ways, right? I mean, there were frequent calls for boycotts of wineries or any business that did business that worked with the Chinese, and they just never took root. There was a lot of noise, but not much action, because I think the Chinese had an integral part in the culture and the economy of the valley that just couldn't be ignored. The peak of economic power was probably in the mid 1880s, 1887 or so, where they successfully both struck for the raise to get their raise up to $1.50 and stood up to the anti-Chinese League in St. Helena. I think that was probably the peak of power, and then it did kind of go down from there. But as I mentioned, the demographic trends were just too strong. So to close, one thing you always got to do in an academic paper is you have to point out opportunities for further research that perhaps you don't have time or is outside your scope. And these are some things that I have thought about that I think are worth discussing. They're not part of my thesis, is just trying to get my handle on the entire Napa Valley and the Chinese immigrant experience. But I think just briefly thinking about the experience of the Chinese immigrant laborers back in 1870 and 1900s and what we're seeing today. Obviously, there's a lot of, I think, pretty horrible parallels that you could have a really interesting kind of study on that. There's also a lot, when you read a lot of the contemporaneous sources then, a lot of the terms, a lot of what they talked about, the Chinese labor in Napa Valley and Black and African-American labor in the South, there were a lot of common terms. It was interesting because at that point, African-Americans were free. They were not slaves anymore, but there were a lot of Jim Crow laws. And it was interesting, the parallels there, how both of kind of the ruling kind of racial classes sought to kind of exploit and manage the kind of laboring underclass. There's a lot of similarities there. There's also a potentially interesting similarities between the Italian immigrant experience and the Chinese immigrant experience. So Italians, while they were a white European group, were a lower class and very discriminated against in the scope there, not nearly to the extent of the Chinese, but they were certainly on the lower rung. And you compare their experience with how the Chinese did. And finally, just thinking about, there were multiple stories about murder and mayhem in Chinatown. The newspaper is full of these kind of salacious stories. Were they all true? Was it really that bad? Or was it more fake news kind of stuff to kind of designed to make Chinatown look worse in the eyes of citizens? We don't know. And that, I think, would be an interesting discussion to have. So anyway, that is the story of at least a small part of the story of Chinese immigrants labor in Napa Valley. Not forgotten, and we want them to we want to keep really, I think, honoring and remembering their contribution. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for your presentation and really bringing the symbolic shovel and unearthing this forgotten Chinatown buried in time and general knowledge. In many ways, I feel like this shovel has also been passed on to us to continue shedding light on this story and reclaiming the Chinese workers' contribution to the Napa story. Now, our Q&A session will begin just briefly. And so if anyone have questions for John, please send it to CHSA Q&A and we'll go get those questions lined up. And while they're continuously coming in, John, I just want to say that the story that you shared about Chinese migrants bringing their family lineage scrolls to America really made me think about what life these Chinese migrants had envisioned for themselves in America. I mean, these records of lineage isn't something a person would bring with them on a business trip or on a holiday. So I was wondering if they ever even imagined, making that journey back home to see their family and friends again. And on that note of human connection, I was sure from the history that you shared with us that they found one another in America, and with one another, they founded a community with whom they shared the language, culture, heritage, and traditions with. And their resilience to have rooted themselves to that socially inhospitable place for the duration that they did is just astounding. It's really a testament to the strength of our bond as human beings when we care for, feel for one another. And one cultural practice very important in the Chinese tradition is taking care of our loved ones after they have passed on. And you mentioned that they even held funeral processions in Napa. And to kick off the Q&A, one of my questions for you, John, is did the community have its own graveyard? And if so, is the graveyard still around today? And tying it all together, and I think this is also a question that came up in the chat, is Do you know if family members of those people are aware of this history?
That is a good question. We know some family members are. I mean, Zhuzhou, the reason we know anything about him was because his family, his descendants wrote, wrote about it and kind of communicated. And there has been, and there were multiple stories in the papers in like the 50s and 60s of people remarking and talking about when they grew up in Chinatown. So there is some certainly knowledge about it. The graveyard thing is an interesting question. The goal always apparently was you wanted to be buried back in China. That was the goal. Is that was and so if you could afford it at all, you would you'd set some money aside, or the Chinese six companies would pay for you. Your bone you would be buried locally, but you'd be disinterred and shipped back to China. But some people lived in such poverty that it was not a possibility. But that was the goal. As far as graveyards, so the two main graveyards. There's a cemetery in St. Helena and the cemetery in Napa, Tulake Cemetery in Napa, and most of they were buried there. Most of the tombstones, unfortunately, were wood, and so they did not survive. There are in Tulake, at least, there is there's a spot called China Square. And there are a few stone monuments there with some Chinese writing. So there is some elements there, but it's very much it's not many. Most of the markers were no longer there. We don't know how many are buried there. Apparently now we don't know how many went back to were eventually disinterred and went back to China and so on. But that was kind of the practice.
Thank you for sharing that with us. So a question from the audience, a question regarding the physical remnants of that time. Thelma is asking, are there any remnants, artifacts left from the Chinese mining settlements?
No, that I have done a little bit of research on that. I can't find anything. The mines were all closed down. What happened was Mercury wasn't as big a deal now as it was then, and all the mines, they basically mined like mines tend to do. You have the easy stuff first, and then you keep going. And they all closed down around the early 1900s. As far as I can tell, there was not a labor replacement thing. It was just more the lines kind of ended more or less at the same time the Chinese left the Napa Valley. And I have looked to see if there's, the Great Western Mine was a fairly big expanse of land. Can you get to it now? What is there? And I can't find anything right now on that. And of course, as we saw, the buildings were all wood, and so those were just went back to the ground, kind of disintegrated over time.
Another question coming from Jenny, who is an associate professor at the California State University of Fresno in anthropology and Asian American studies, whom we did our Chinese American restaurant program earlier this year with. And Jenny is asking, are there any oral histories by fourth generation Chinese American descendants of these wine laborers? She's also wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more on the systemic racism that created, quote unquote, the bad.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's a good part. Are there? Yes, there definitely are. I know in Napa, there was the Chan family was the one. They were one of the main families in Napa's Chinatown, and their descendants lived in Napa for multiple generations. So that does happen. We don't have many though. There are not many histories. The Chan and the Joes are almost like one of the only couple, and it's interesting. There's multiple articles over the years and decades, and most of the articles are about those families. And so I don't know. It's unclear actually if they were the only ones or if they were just the ones that everybody knew about and kept going back to. Right. So unfortunately, I think that's kind of lost at this point, as far as I can tell, at least right now. I mean, I've got another 6 months of research to do for my thesis, so I might find something else. And I think as far as the systemic racism, I mean, that's what's just so, it's frustrating now. It's frustrating when you read things then about how, as mentioned, like the discriminatory framework that the Chinese Americans or Chinese had to put up with at that time at the national, state, and local level. And then there was the audacity to complain how they were not integrating into society, right? And we're not shopping in downtown Napa or downtown St. Helena. It's like when they were harassed, they had to really gather together for protection as much as anything else. So no, I think the systemic, the framework of racism that was put in there made it, this is what to me is so remarkable, right? It made it almost impossible for them to succeed, but yet they did. And I think that is, to me, that's kind of the nugget here, is like, it's easy to be down on on citizens of the the white citizens. But it's better to look at everything that was accomplished despite that that discrimination.
Thank you. Mei Li asked a great hard-hitting question, very intersectional. And Mei Li asked, why did the Mexican, Chilean, and Native Americans exit the labor market? Did they exit by choice or were they forced out?
That's a really good question, and I have not. I don't know actually the answer to the question. I was looking at there's a lot of labor, a lot of racial labor movements, movements of laborers that came through California about that time. So no, I don't know. I mean, I know I don't know if Native Americans is pretty. I think they basically were pushed out. They what suffered with how the Chinese suffered, the Native Americans suffered before that. So that's probably relatively easy to explain. The Mexicans and the Chileans, I do not know. That was in one of the books one of the sources they were talking about. That was the flow of labor. It's it's Native American, Chilean, Mexican, supplanted by Chinese, then eventually supplanted by Italians mostly, and Japanese to a little bit. But no, the forces. That's a good question. I wish I had the answer to that one. Maybe that'll be something for me to study myself.
Mei Li has another question, and Mei Li is wondering if the fires starting in the towns were by the town peoples outside, or did the fires arise for other reasons?
That is a great question. There were two in St. Helena Chinatown is the one we know mostly. There were two major fires that went through. One in 1894 and 1904, something like that. And the papers everybody was speculating in the paper that of the time when they're talking about it, because it was a big deal, whether the citizens cared that much that Chinatown was burning or worried that Chinatown fire would spread to the rest of the town. We don't know, but there was speculation that it was anti-Chinese agitators that had would set it. But no, it turned out in both cases they found the source, and it was accidentally set. There was the first big fire that destroyed about half of Chinatown. It was an indigent Chinese, poverty-stricken Chinese man who had a cooking fire inside one of the buildings and had accidentally left the fire going, and he left for something, and the fire took off and burned down half of Chinatown. So no, you would think so. It's surprising to me that it wasn't, but apparently they were actually both. It was just accidental fires, which I think in wood structures close together, poorly built, it was probably inevitable.
Thank you for explaining that. A question from Cheryl, and Cheryl is wondering if one wanted to take a field trip to Napa, what are some sites of interest to visit so that they can learn more or to honor this part of history? Any museums, landmarks, tours, etc., that you would recommend?
That's a good question. Very little, actually. I mean, you really have to search for it. There are a couple of Behringer Brothers winery in Napa, which I showed the picture of. That was a known. So a step back. What you have to do, you have to look for any wineries that are over 120 years old would be a starting point, right? And almost everything in the late 1800s would undoubtedly had Chinese laborers associated with them. Behringer Brothers, the wine caves are a very notable, kind of thing to do. You can go there's a museum in the Sharpstein Museum in Calistoga, excellent museum, has the dioramas which show things, a really great way to kind of see the relation of the town and Chinatown together, and how those and you see kind of this position in space of how they dealt with Chinatown and the rest of the buildings, which I think are interesting. Napa Valley Historical Society, which has a spot in downtown Napa, is worth doing. But no, there's actually not much that I'm aware of there. So Merriam is actually, which I would trust Merriam for sure. Tramsburg has caves, so wine caves would be a good one to do. You also can visit Tule Cay Cemetery and go to the China Square and see those there. And I mentioned Napa. There is that the China Point Park, and that that circle, that sculpture was meant to symbolize a moon, which is meant to symbolize, I guess, the Chinese legacy in Napa. So that is worth. But no, most of the artifacts are gone. You can see a couple of things. There's some brick walls, stone walls still in place that were built by the Chinese, but not that many.
April has a question on your research methods or just experience of conducting that research. And April asked if you came across any Chinese language primary sources in that period throughout the wine country.
I have not. There is, and we'd have to get, obviously somebody. I do not speak Chinese, but no, this is where it's an interesting thing. It's so frustrating lack of sources of speaking from the Chinese themselves. So no, we have not. It would be interesting, I think, looking at the gravestones. There are Chinese things there, and you occasionally see a picture of something, but no, there's almost nothing there. And as I mentioned, was it because everybody was illiterate, which many were, right? The people that were immigrating, I mean, they were immigrating from China for a reason, right? I mean, these were poor peasants and agriculture workers there that came here to make to make some money or have some economic opportunity. So it was not an educated class. And I don't know the educational level of the peasant class in China in late 1800s, but I imagine it wasn't very high. So no, I don't think we had a whole lot. I know a lot of them would go to Chinese six companies in San Francisco to have things written that would be sent home and so on. So I know that was a way that they did it, but no, we have very little here. Matter of fact, it's really interesting. The only things we really like, do we know some names? A lot of times, the only way you can know names of some of the Chinese residents, you look at the newspaper articles when they're getting arrested for disturbing the peace. And then they'll talk about the name, and they may even quote somebody, which is kind of nice. And they quote it in this kind of horrible pidgin English, so it's hard to really get it. But that's the only way you really hear a lot of the names of the people that lived here.
We have another question from Mei Li, and Mei Li is asking, historians said white townspeople didn't like Chinatown because of all the shacks. And they're wondering who built the shacks. Were Chinese allowed to build more substantial buildings? Could they have even afforded to build those at $1 a day? Did other workers have better quarters?
That's a good question. So they were allowed to build on the land. So they couldn't own the land, and they didn't, but they were able to build. And that's what happened, right? They would rent a spot, from John Gillum or whatever, and they would construct their own buildings. It's interesting, and they were relatively substantial. When the first fire went through St. Helena's Chinatown in the 1890s or whatever it was, the paper talks about how several stores were burned down or severely damaged from the fire, and they were Chinese in Chinatown, and those business owners had insurance and were able to get insurance to rebuild their buildings. So this is not, I mean, when we look at the pictures, it seems pretty, it seems haphazard, but there was an infrastructure there. But because they couldn't own their building, I have a feeling that you probably put them up as cheaply as possible. Though the one exceptions, or perhaps the exception, would be the Joss houses, where the temples that it looks like had significant community involvement. There was a significant amount of money put in there. And I understand the altar from the Napa Joss house is actually at the museum at the Chinese Historical Society in San Francisco. So that was when that was decimated as part of the reclamation for the river for flood control. That was shipped to the museum in San Francisco. So,
Julie asked, "How did you first become interested in this topic?"
Yeah, it's interesting. Became interested because I was reading. It was in the Chinese the class on U.S.-China relations, and reading about the immigrant kind of lifestyle, and I stumbled on, it was Miriam's article on the St. Helena Historical Society, and it was amazing, and I was angry that I had not heard that. I was not taught that, right? That was something, a part of, we learn about George Yount, we learn about the Native Americans, but we never learned about this 30-year gap where in the not the discrimination, but the contributions. And I made it, and so when I tried to find more information, there's very little. And so that's when I decided, my purpose here is to kind of bring standing on the backs of all the people that have worked before, kind of bring it more to light.
We have a question from Jonathan Aloy, who was with us 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago, actually. Hi, Jonathan.
And Jonathan is asking, was and is there a culture or history of wine growing in China today? I guess in the past.
That's a great question, actually. That's a great question. I think Joyce was actually, when I was speaking to Joyce Chan earlier, we were talking about actually, wine, about Chinese, people in vineyards today. So today there is, but not, I don't know back in the 1800s if there was or not. It seemed to be a pretty much, I don't know if the soil did it, or if it's, it's a fairly, it requires a lot of land to make a bottle of wine. And I don't know if especially if it was a poor area, if it would be economic, if that's the best use of land to get the most nutrition out of the land. So I don't know. That's a good question, Jonathan.
We have a question from Rojin, and they asked, did the Japanese get into the wine industry, or was it mainly the Italians?
It was mainly Italians. I mean, the Japanese came in and were used in a lot of the same ways, I think, as servants and whatever the Chinese were. But no, it was the Italians were basically the laboring class that kind of came in and took over and became the one of the main laboring classes, at least in the early 1900s. And then, of course, as you move forward in the 1900s, it becomes a more of a polyglot, and then eventually it was more, I think, Mexican Americans and a lot of Hispanic immigrants, took over as well. But it was mainly the Italians that was their kind of a way in. But the Italians came in; they both came in as where it's different than the Chinese. They came in. Some of them actually owned wineries. Some of them came in to make wine because they had that skill from Italy. As well as some came in to just to work the vineyard. So it was a different kind. It was more of a stratified workforce than the Chinese, who only came in to do that. And in fact, I have my great grandfather came in, and there was the wine business is what they got into. And it was because from Italy, and that was part of their skill set.
We have a bit of a legal case study question for you as well. And Marianne is asking if you could share a little bit more about the lawsuit between the new Chinatown owners and the tenants.
Yeah, well, that was an interesting thing. That lawsuit, I think, was really fascinating to think how they used the law, and it's fascinating to me because the Chinese were not really protected by the law. Right. I don't think there was really much. I doubt there was much recourse if you were, a white citizen and you attacked or hurt a Chinese person. You couldn't, the Chinese people, they couldn't serve on juries. Right. They couldn't do a lot, but yet they knew enough and were organized enough to take the law in their hands to do lawsuits. So beyond the story of how they did that and how they kept it tied up in courts for 25 years, I just think it's another, I think, way that they took the little bit of leverage that they had and made something more out of it is just impressive. But there is a whole story behind the lawsuit, and there was multiple stories because the paper covered it fairly breathlessly at the time because they thought, well, when are we going to get rid of Chinatown? And it just didn't happen over time, and there were lots of angles back and forth, but details.
Anna is wondering if all the vineyard owners were white, or were there Mexican vineyard owners as well?
That's a good question. Everyone that was ever been discussed that I've seen, Mary may know better than I do, were white. There certainly were a lot of land grants that were one of the key things, I guess, is when Mexico was ceded California to the United States. A lot of the land grants that were deeded from Mexico were maintained, and so those were a lot. So there wasn't options, So when people want to come buy land in California for agriculture, there are relatively few available because of the historic land grants. I don't know about that, about whether Mexican. I did not see any whenever they are interviewed that I read or anything. They always have pretty Anglo names. So I have a feeling there'd be a lot of discrimination against them too for trying to do business in the United States, but that would just be speculation.
Winifred is wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what is the Chinese Six?
Oh, the six companies. So as I understand, this is part more of San Francisco Chinese history than Napa Valley per se, but they were a fairly powerful organization that really that did a lot to represent and spearhead and represent Chinese interests for Chinese coming in from China. And they did labor. They certainly kind of worked on putting people into laborers in different locations. They would help as like an employment agency. They would also represent Chinese in a variety of discrimination acts. Certainly in the 1900s, there were as additional levels of discriminatory labor practices were happening against Chinese. The six companies would work to represent those Chinese people and defend them. So they were, I think, an advocacy group. They also, though, were, as I understand it, there was, a fair bit of, they were also kind of the big 6 families, I think, or that made them up, they were certainly powerful and had their own self-interest as well. So I don't think they were strictly all benevolent, but they did speak, and they were probably the biggest organization speaking for Chinese at the time.
Thank you. And Carrie is wondering, do you think you might write a book about this?
I would love to. That's my next step after the thesis, which has to be it'll be several hundred pages. I think a book. That's one of the challenges too when I'm doing the research. Even in the popular press, it gets just like a single mention, right? It'll be just a chapter in a book or just a few pages in a book, and there is such rich history here because I personally haven't even scratched the surface on what went on in Napa or Calistoga or whatever. And so I think there is a bigger story to tell that it would be great. I think we'd love to get that get out there for everybody to read.
Yeah, it looks like our guests here are also very excited and interested to see this book that maybe you would be writing. And so it looks like we've hit the bottom of our list of questions. If anyone still have any remaining questions for John, please send it into the chat and we'll get those answered. Maybe we just wait a few moments and let's see if any other questions will trickle in.
Yeah, and I certainly would. I see Miriam Hansen has commented on the chat, and she is, as I said, my kind of inspiration as far as doing this more. So she's definitely is very knowledgeable certainly about St. Helena in particular, but Napa Valley generally in the Chinese experience.
Here we have a question coming from Jenny, and Jenny is asking, what do Chinese in China think about the Chinese wine history? They must buy some wine too.
I'm sure they do. I do not know that. I haven't done much with the contemporary history there, but that's a good question.
Okay, well, if that's all the questions for now, then I think this is where we will end the program. I know we did run a little bit later than our schedule, but thank you, John, for kindly agreeing to extend this Q&A session. Yeah, it's been also really great to watch the chat and see all these great resources flying in. We will have a transcript of the chat, so I think in the follow-up email, we will include all the links that's kind of flying around, and we'll have that included in that email so everyone can have access to those resources. So our next event will be held on July 24th, where our guest speakers will be telling the story of the Kim Liu sisters who broke through the bamboo ceiling into Broadway and became the first Asian American act to star in the Broadway musical venues. So thank you again, everyone. And we hope to see you at our next program in July. And thank you again, John, for joining us. And everyone, please have a safe and wonderful rest of your day. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.